Maar nu niet voordat ik met veel trots de eerste spreker van vandaag aan jullie voorstel. And for that introduction I will switch to English. Our keynote speaker is a true example of what team-based science could look like. He is director of the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health, certified in both internal and nuclear medicine, and he connects neuroscience with religion and spirituality. And besides that, he still managed, and I admire that, to find time to become the author of several best-selling books. So we are very proud to have you here today, Professor Newberg in Maastricht. Professor Newberg has been mentioned as one of the most influential neuroscientists of today. Please join me to give a warm welcome to Prof. Andrew Newberg.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been enjoying much of your hospitality over the last couple of days, and I am very excited to be able to share with you a lot of the research that I have been involved with over the last 25 to 30 years. Hopefully, I don't look that old, but I do enjoy sharing the work that I have been able to do, and hope that you'll find it interesting and helpful in the context of your own work as you work with patients, as you maybe look into research questions that deal with the mind, that deal with consciousness, that deal with our sense of spirituality. So my presentation today is entitled The Varieties of Spiritual Experience, which actually does have a lot to do with some of my more recent research that we'll be talking about. And I'm also going to touch a little bit on a concept called neurotheology. I'm not sure how much any of you have heard of that term, but hopefully you will know more about it by the end of the talk today. So what exactly are spiritual experiences? Many of you may have had them. Many of your patients may have them. But there are many different terms and ideas and concepts that come about when people talk about having a spiritual experience. And sometimes they talk about it in the context of knowledge or wisdom, various cognitive processes. Sometimes they talk about them in emotional terms, in terms of feelings of love, liberation, ecstasy. Sometimes they're more experiential. They have something to do with the sense of self or the disappearance of the sense of self. And so there can be many different ways of thinking about what these spiritual experiences are. I've been able to do some brain scan studies, which I'll be sharing with you in a little bit later, when people are engaged in spiritual practices having these kinds of experiences. But I think it's very important for us to understand the qualitative, the subjective nature of what these experiences are about. And I want to review some of that at the beginning here so that it gives us a basis for which we can understand what these spiritual experiences actually are. Now, I would also like to say that I think when you overall think about what spiritual experiences are, there is a range, there is a continuum. They range from the everyday kind of an experience. We experienced this a little bit when we went into some of the cathedrals in Maastricht and in some of the other wonderful cities in the Netherlands. So when you walk into one of those synagogues, churches, you feel something. It may be mild, but it can be very moving. It can be very important for a person. There can be creative or aesthetic experiences, and sometimes we see this more in people who don't necessarily adhere to a particular religious tradition, but nonetheless feel something spiritual in their lives, and they express it through creativity, through aesthetics, through perhaps being in nature and looking at the beautiful mountains or the ocean. There are meditation and prayer experiences when people engage deeply in some type of spiritual practice, and we will talk about that in a little bit more detail in a few moments. Then people can have very intense experiences that might border on mystical or enlightenment kinds of experiences. So I think there is some kind of continuum, but how do we define that continuum? Does it have something to do with the intensity of the experience, different elements of this experience? One approach that has sometimes been taken has to do with the sense of oneness or unity that is a part of these experiences. And if you look at this little figure here, people often go from the very distinctive aspect of where we are in the world today, that it is me and the world. So there's a clear distinction between self and other, self and world. But as we go through these different types of experiences, there seems to be a merging of the sense of self with the world. We can have flow experiences where this could be an athlete in the zone, or this could be a fighter pilot dealing with all kinds of information, and they just kind of get taken over by the experience. all the way to feelings of romantic love where you're intimately connected with another individual, and then to the peak or mystical experiences where you become one with everything, and there is no differentiation between self and world. So this is just one aspect of these experiences that can have a continuum in and of itself, but there can be many other elements of these experiences that can also provide a sense of a continuum, and we will discuss this. But to put a little historical perspective into all of this, spiritual experiences exist throughout the world and really have existed throughout time. We see these in all the traditions, and to just give a very brief overview, certainly in the monotheistic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, we see spiritual experiences had by many individuals, and again, a range of those experiences. The more intense spiritual experiences, the more mystical of these experiences, typically come in the mystical aspects of these traditions. So, for example, Jewish Kabbalistic teachings have to do with the idea of a mystical union with God, which is what the ultimate goal is of prayer, of the different spiritual practices that a person may do. In a similar context, in the Christian perspective, the Christian mystic also is working on trying to make that connection, that intimate connection with God, forming some type of mystical union with what God is, the Spirit of God in this particular context. Sufism in the Islamic perspective is the mystical union also with God, but because of the Quranic teachings that are part of the tradition. So by following the Islamic tradition, by following the various practices, the goal ultimately is to achieve this other kind of mystical union. The term enlightenment itself is not typically used in monotheistic traditions as much as it is in the context of various Eastern traditions, such as Buddhism and Hinduism. In Hinduism, consciousness is really seen as the essence from which the universe emerges. So we often talk about the distinction between the brain and consciousness, where matter is and where something non-material may be. Well, for Hinduism, that's not really much of a problem. It is basically assumed that the universe is imbued with consciousness, and so our sense of enlightenment, our sense of the mystical, is basically connecting with that ultimate consciousness and becoming part of that fundamental reality. Taoism has to do with the harmony of life and connecting with that harmony of life in which we feel that natural flow, and by doing that, we achieve a sense of spiritual enlightenment. In Buddhism, enlightenment is a bit more personal. It's often brought about through practices such as meditation and continued self-reflection. And of course, one of the more well-known sects of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, has to do with realizing this radical truth that that the reality that we typically experience is really considered an illusion, and that it is just based on how our mind is processing information, and we need to get to that detached sense of consciousness, of infinite consciousness, that is a part of the Buddhist perspective. Now, if we leap ahead to the present day, where we start to talk about the neurology and the psychiatry of these different experiences, part of what, in my view, is really a fascinating aspect for us to explore are the many ways in which people can have these different kinds of experiences. They can happen spontaneously. And as we'll talk about, I'm going to mention our survey that we did of people's spiritual experiences, where people described all the different ways in which they had these experiences. And some of my favorite ones were spontaneous. A person driving their car down the street, and suddenly they just saw the entire universe in a different way. That's true distracted driving in that case. But the spontaneous experiences can happen to anyone and anywhere. But what we typically think about when we're talking about spiritual experiences is that they come from various spiritual practices. So we talk about practices such as meditation, prayer. We've done some interesting studies of people doing a practice called speaking in tongues, or glossolalia, where they make these different verbal vocalizations that sort of sound like language, but don't really have anything to do specifically with a language that we know of. There can also be other types of trance states that people can get into as part of the practices. So all these different practices that lead to spiritual experiences are also important for us to think about and to look at. All of these are really pieces of a puzzle, so to speak, because we can look at how each of them affect us, affect the brain, affect the mind, and lead to these different kinds of experiences. Near-death experiences, some of your patients may have had those. These obviously occur when a person is typically near to death. Maybe they've had a heart attack, maybe they've been in a car accident, they've been revived, and they have some incredible report of an experience where they floated out of their body, where they saw some beautiful light. Well, these are very powerful experiences that are truly transformational for these individuals. And why do they happen to occur when a person is near death? And what might that mean for us as human beings in terms of how our mind and our consciousness intersect with the biology of the brain? Various psychiatric disorders have long been known to be associated with people who have unusual spiritual feelings. All of us know of the person who is in the inpatient psychiatric facility who believes that they are Jesus Christ. I personally have been visited by at least 6 or 7 people claiming to be the Messiah who wanted me to scan their brains to prove that somehow their brain was a little bit different than everybody else's. So, can we actually use brain scanning to even help us to figure out when the next Messiah comes? I don't know. But I don't think I'm going to go down that path. But certainly, people become hyper-religious when they have bipolar disorder in the manic phase. So what's going on? Why do people have these different kinds of feelings when they have different psychiatric conditions? And of course, the opposite is also true. When people have profound depression, sometimes they lose their sense of religiousness or spirituality. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. Different neurological disorders have also been thought of in the context of spiritual experiences. So the most common one are people with temporal lobe epilepsy, the TLE here. When people have seizures, particularly in the temporal lobes, they seem to be associated with some unusual spiritual experiences. Now, the one problem with all of this, especially when you're talking about psychiatric or neurological conditions, is that that tends to get us to a point of over-pathologizing these experiences. People think that, these experiences are just pathological as opposed to something that's natural and ultimately very meaningful. So it's helpful to look at these experiences as they relate to these different neurological and psychiatric conditions, but again, that's just one piece of the puzzle. And as you'll be hearing about in the next talk, the large and growing area of psychedelics and what they do, the kinds of experiences that people have under the influence of various psychedelics, very useful for us to understand what's going on brain-wise, because we know the psychedelic compounds go to certain receptors, serotonin, dopamine, whatever that they're going to, and we can then try to link that up to the different kinds of experiences that people are having. But let me just say here, because to me this is ultimately where a lot of my questioning comes from in this entire field, is what do we ultimately consider to be the realness of these experiences? And for shamanic cultures throughout time who have used magic mushrooms and ayahuasca and so forth, for them, when they take these compounds, those do not become artificial experiences for them, but they become the windows, the doorways to enable their brain, to enable their mind to enter into a spiritual realm. And so for them, it just makes the experience real. It doesn't make it artificial. In our way of thinking about things, we tend to say, you took the drug, and so it created that experience. It made that experience. It becomes sort of an artificial aspect of this experience. But for the people who have had them, they are profound experiences that really can be transformative and can change their lives. And again, I know you'll be hearing a little bit more about that in the next presentation. So where in the brain do these spiritual experiences occur? Well, you've already heard a little bit of what these experiences are like. So perhaps it should come as no surprise that there are lots of different parts of the brain that become involved with these experiences. And I know all of you know this, but these different areas of the brain, but some of the areas that I'm going to be focusing on include areas such as the frontal cortex, and particularly the prefrontal cortex, which I sometimes refer to as an attention area. Obviously, as you know, the frontal lobe does a lot of different things for us, but part of what it does in particular is help us to focus our attention. So if you're now focusing your attention on a visual image of Jesus on the cross or a mantra, perhaps your frontal lobe activity is going to go up. And if you have an experience where you kind of lose your sense of purposefulness, you surrender to the experience, perhaps your frontal lobes will go down, and we're going to see some scans of that in a few moments. Another important area that I like to talk about is the parietal lobe that typically helps us with our self-orientation, particularly spatially. And we have often talked about the parietal lobe's involvement in these experiences because people frequently lose that sense of self, and they lose that sense of how the self connects with the world. So that may have something to do with what's going on in the parietal lobe, as we will see. The temporal lobe, also very involved because of the relationship with our language, with our emotions, of course, when we get into the limbic areas. So depending on the different elements of these experiences, we might expect a variety of these different parts of the brain to be involved. And the limbic system in particular, as we get a little bit deeper into the brain, areas such as the hippocampus and amygdala are likely to be very involved in these experiences, particularly those that carry a deep emotional content to them. So we'll be looking at all of these different areas of the brain when we start to go into the brain scan studies that we'll be reviewing. But this brings me back to the point that I made earlier, which is that there is not just one part of our brain that turns on when somebody starts to pray or when you walk into a church. It's not like this little area of the brain just turns on, but there are many different parts of the brain that become involved with these experiences because they are so rich and they are so diverse for people. So if you start to have various cognitive elements of these experiences, the sense of oneness, a sense of clarity, a sense of wisdom, then perhaps it is something that's going on in these cognitive areas, the areas of the brain that support our cognitive processes. When it affects the beliefs, your sense of faith, for example, perhaps that also has something to do with the cognitive, the memory areas of the brain, like the hippocampus and some parts of the temporal and parietal lobes. I've already mentioned a little bit about the emotions. Frequently, these experiences are associated with profound feelings of joy, awe, peace. Perhaps there's something going on in the emotional areas of the brain when people have these aspects of these experiences. The experiential part of these experiences has to do with the sensory, I should say the sensory experiential parts. So people see things, they hear things, they feel things in their body. And so there are all these different sensory areas of the brain that can become involved. In the context of psychology and psychiatry, we can talk about how does this all have an effect on our psyche, on our anxiety, our depression. How does it change the way we think about the world around us, how we cope and deal with the world around us, how we interact with people. All of these can be affected by these experiences. And then finally, there seems to be a transformational element. There's something that literally changes within the person that could have very important implications in terms of how they heal from various physical or mental health problems. So part of what I'm going to be sharing with you today comes from an online survey that we ran over the past 5 years. This actually goes back about 8 or 10 years now, but it was about a 5 to 6 year study where we asked people all kinds of questions, and we got about 2,000 respondents over this period of time. We got information about their demographics, who they were, how old they were, their religious tradition, their religious background. We asked them about their medical conditions, their psychological conditions. We asked them, we gave them questionnaires about their sense of spirituality and so forth. And then we ultimately gave them a box and we said, tell us about your spiritual experience. And we left it as vague as possible because we just wanted to hear what people had to say about these experiences. And then ultimately we could take all of this information. It was really a treasure trove of data. We've published about 6 or 8 articles already. And a lot of it had to do with how we analyze these different experiences. This, to me, becomes so important because when we start to go back to the brain itself, unless I know what the experience actually is and how it affects a person, I really can't say very much about what's going on in the brain. So I need both pieces of information to help us to be able to figure out how best to understand what these experiences are, how they intersect with our biology, and how they ultimately intersect with our psyche. So this was one of the early word clouds that we came up with that reflected just all of the different words that people used. Not surprisingly, there was a lot of words that were used that had to do with spirituality, religion, experience, God, also the notion of reality. And that to me is also a very important point. of what these experiences do for people, which is that they change their perspective on reality, which to me has always been one of my burning questions about how and why we feel that certain things are real. But we can go beyond this. We can actually go into a more detailed analysis, and when we do that, we come up with the idea that there are basically 5 core elements of these experiences. One of the important points is that almost all of these experiences are unique. Every person seems to have a unique character to their experiences. But within that uniqueness, there are certain elements which we can group together into these core components. So one of them is a sense of intensity. And I'm going to explain all of these in a few moments. But one of them is a sense of intensity, a sense of clarity, a sense of unity, a sense of surrender or letting go, as people would sometimes say, and some type of transformational, permanent effect that is the result of this kind of an experience. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. So the sense of intensity to me, is a very important part of these experiences, because there is something that distinguishes the spiritual experience from the everyday experience. There's something different about when the person is in church, is in synagogue, is in a mosque, that they say, I feel something. I feel it more. And of course, when people have mystical experiences, they go well beyond what we typically think about as an ordinary experience. So here was a description of a 43-year-old male who answered our survey. And he said this, he said, "I, as an unnameable but individual being, was traveling down an infinite roller coaster, like waves of pure white ecstatic light. The ecstasy was overwhelming and rose and fell in intensity with the waves of light. The light path seemed infinitely long in both directions. The sense of the being and the light was infinitely more real than anything I had ever experienced." And the capitalization of that was from him, not from us. So you can see so many terms in here that talk about intensity, being unnameable, being on an infinite roller coaster, overwhelming, infinitely more real. So clearly there's something going on in this experience which is so far beyond what anything that this particular person has experienced. So where in the brain might this occur? So here's one of the first scans that we're going to be looking at. Not sure how many of you have seen SPECT scans, but this is a very common technique that we have used for a lot of our studies. We've used pretty much every imaging methodology available. So sometimes we use functional MRI, sometimes we use PET imaging, sometimes we use SPECT imaging. And sometimes the reason that we use SPECT imaging, again, I'm not sure how familiar you all are with SPECT imaging. It stands for single photon emission computed tomography. Basically what we do is we inject a small amount of a radioactive tracer, in this case one that goes to follows blood flow in the brain, and of course the more blood flow, presumably the more active that particular part of the brain is, and it's reflected in the colors that we see. Part of why we use this approach a lot in our practice, in the study of various spiritual practices, is that unless you can be in a scan or lying down and not move, you really can't do an MRI scan for somebody while they're doing a prayer practice. So sometimes when people need to be in a certain position, or if they need to be moving around or whatever, by doing a SPECT scan, what we do is we put in a small intravenous catheter before they actually do the practice, and then while they're in the midst of the practice, we inject them through that IV catheter so we don't disturb them at all, and as long as they don't do some real huge movement and yank that IV out, the tracer gets up into the body, gets up into the brain, and it captures the moment that we did the injection. Then when we put them into the scanner a short time later, anything that went on in between doesn't really affect the scan, so it captures a snapshot of when the person was in prayer, in meditation. So here is a scan of one of our practitioners in a deep prayer practice, and the arrow is pointing where the limbic system is, basically, in this sort of central area of the temporal lobe. And you can see this is the baseline scan. So this is when the person was just at rest. They weren't doing anything in particular. And in a moment, I'm going to show you what their scan now looks like when they're deep in prayer. But the scan itself reveals that the limbic system becomes far more active in the midst of this practice. So here we see, in fact, let me see if I can use the pointer here. You can see that where the arrow is a little bit of red activity during the baseline state. And then when the person is deep in their prayer practice, we see a very substantial increase in this red activity in the limbic system. And please, for those of you who aren't familiar with SPECT imaging, all of this is quantified. So this all has to do with how many radioactive counts are coming out of that particular area. And we can quantify the activity in these areas of the brain and do statistical analyses, which is what we typically publish on. But the idea that the limbic system becomes very active as the primary emotional driver of the brain, it helps to signify for the person that this is a very important experience and that this is something that is worth paying attention to, it's worth understanding, and is very powerful in terms of ultimately through the hippocampal activation in terms of writing this into the memory of the person. So this is something now that not only happens in the moment, but is part of that transformative part that we'll talk about a little bit later that changes the way the person thinks and feels about the world. The next element is clarity. This is frequently described. People say, I finally understand how the world works. I finally understand what spirituality is. I finally understand what religion is. I finally understand what science is. Whatever it is that they say, it's that they finally get it and they understand the way the world is in a way that they had never done before. The proverbial veil has been thrown off them and they are able to see the world clearly. So here's a description of a 37-year-old scientist, a 37-year-old female scientist who said this. She said, everything in life seemed to click. I had this clarity and it was as if I was looking at life from the inside out. Despite my trepidation, this experience seemed to satisfy my proof-oriented mentality with the concept of intuition. It was almost as if my intuition from somewhere deeper had offered some sort of direct experience that offered up proof. So for somebody who was a scientist who'd been going down this path of doing all kinds of scientific experiments, she finally realized that this kind of intuitive process that she now felt as part of the spiritual experience was a better proof than what she was looking at from a scientific perspective. And isn't that interesting? What does that mean? And what can we say about the true nature of these experiences? We'll talk about a little bit later. But certainly for the individual, it carries a very profound sense of clarity and meaning for them to have this kind of experience. So where does this happen in the brain? Well, we're not totally sure because a sense of clarity is not something that we typically identify with a clear cognitive process. But I have often thought about the thalamus in this regard because the thalamus, of course, is a very central structure in the brain. It takes a lot of our sensory information, particularly auditory and visual, to direct it up into the higher cortical areas. And the thalamus, because it is such a central structure, helps different cortical areas connect with each other. And some people have argued that the thalamus is key to our overall perception of reality. Now, what we have found is that the thalamus does seem to be somewhat activated and affected by these different experiences, such that here is an actual person who is a non-meditator. This is a resting scan, and you can see that for the most part, their thalamus is relatively symmetric. But when we look at people who have been long-term meditators, long-term prayers, and so forth, we tend to find greater asymmetries in their thalamus at rest. So does that have something to do with the sense of clarity? I don't know for sure, but ultimately there's something going on that's changing the way the brain is actually operating and probably has something to do with that feeling of clarity that's a part of these experiences. I've mentioned this a little earlier about the parietal lobe, but one of the common elements also is this sense of unity, a sense of oneness, a sense of connectedness, which probably has something to do with the feeling of oneness of all things, the oneness of the person with God, the oneness of God. That all of these are various aspects of these experiences that are described that have to do with this sense of oneness and unity. And I have argued over the years that this probably has something to do with our parietal lobe. So if we look at the brain scan, this was from one of our Tibetan Buddhist meditators. This was a scan at rest. And so at rest, we see that where the arrow is pointing, the parietal lobe, looks pretty comparable to the other areas of the brain, the frontal lobes and the other parietal lobe. But when the person spends 45 minutes to an hour deep in meditation where they lose themselves as part of that process, we see that the parietal lobe starts to quiet down. So let me just go back to that. So you can see here, relatively red activity, and then we see a pretty substantial decrease. It's almost all in yellows now. So what we have hypothesized over the years is that as you go through this practice, you begin to deafferent, you begin to essentially block the sensory information that's getting into the parietal lobe. And as the parietal lobe then kind of quiets down and doesn't have that sensory information upon which to work, you lose that differentiation between the self and the world. You have that sense of oneness or connectedness with the universe or with God. And that is something that we have seen over and over in our studies of different practices. And interestingly, in some pathology studies, people have found that those individuals who have tumors or strokes in the parietal lobe are more likely to express feelings of self-transcendence, that self-connectedness to the world, than those people who have lesions in other parts of the brain, like the frontal lobe or the temporal lobe. So the parietal lobe is another important area when it comes to these core elements of these experiences. The fourth core component is this feeling of surrender. Sometimes people describe it as a feeling of letting go. And so here is, I thought, a very fascinating description from a 40-year-old Catholic woman who said this. She said, "I surrendered everything, including my faith and my salvation, and only for one reason. I loved God so much that I would truly give up everything to be connected with him. I said yes, and in an instant, God returned everything to me transformed. From that day forward, a new relationship exists between God and me. It is ever present, no distance, no separation. I am not attached to doctrine, dogmas, or rituals. I see God's actions all around me." So again, you see actually several of the core elements of these experiences, focusing on the initial part of the sense of surrender that she has, but that she loves God so much that she feels connected with God. So we have that sense of oneness and unity as well. And she is transformed. This whole process has transformed her as part of this experience. So where in the brain might this sense of surrender come from? Well, when we did some interesting studies of people engaged in Islamic prayer, of course, the basis of Islam is the idea of surrendering oneself to God. So when people engage in Islamic prayer, what we actually found were significant changes in the frontal lobe. So where the arrows are pointing here, you can see the frontal lobe at rest, where you see a reasonable amount of this sort of reddish, pinkish activity. But when the person is deeply engaged in the practice, we see that that area now becomes almost like into the greens. So there is a significant decrease in activity in the frontal lobes. And of course, if the frontal lobes turn on to give us our sense of kind of willfulness and purposefulness, then when the frontal lobes shut down, that seems to be associated with the kind of giving over that sense of willfulness and purpose, that sense of surrender. And this is also observed in other kinds of flow states. Very interestingly, in some of the states where people are playing music improvisationally, where they're just kind of in the whole flow of everything, the frontal lobe shuts down. So I think we tend to see this in various practices that are associated with the experience of losing one's sense of willfulness and purposefulness and surrendering to the experience. Now, the fifth element is not so much the experience itself, but is the longer-term effect. And this has to do with the transformation that occurs as a result of having this experience. So in our survey, we asked people, how did this change you? How did this change the way you think about your life? And what we found was that the large majority of people did say that these experiences changed them. And most of the time, and we'll talk about this, most of the time, people felt that it changed them for the better. So they felt improvements in their relationships, in the ways they look at their job, their sense of meaning and purpose in life, even their sense of overall health and well-being, and certainly in their sense of religiousness or spirituality. So clearly, these experiences have very positive effects for people, and this is part of why the study of helping to induce these kinds of experiences by the use of different psychedelics may be so valuable, by helping so many people improve and augment various aspects of their life. But it's also important to note that there is a small percentage, maybe 3 to 5%, that say that things didn't go so well. And even in the context of psychedelics, people have bad trips, but sometimes people have experiences where it just terrifies them. where they can't incorporate it into their spiritual or religious beliefs. So sometimes these experiences don't go so well for people. We don't fully understand that just yet, but to me, this is another area for this entire field of research to explore, to help us understand the negative side of religious and spiritual beliefs and experiences. And that can include things like cults, that can include very destructive kinds of behaviors, when people kill in the name of God and so forth. So, what's going on in those people's brains when they are engaged in these more negative, more destructive, more detrimental aspects of these experiences? And we don't have an answer to that just yet, but this kind of data at least tells us that we need to look at that. Now, in the recently published book that we did called The Varieties of Spiritual Experience, which pays homage to the famous William James book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, published a little over 100 years ago, we were trying to update it, so to speak, and try to bring in all of this information. But one of the things that we also did, in addition to looking at the core elements of these experiences, is how can we actually divide them up? Can we categorize them more broadly? And we did what's called a factor analysis, and we looked at how different aspects of these experiences factored into the categorization of these experiences. And we realized that there were three main factors of spiritual experiences. There were numinous experiences, mystical experiences, and what we might refer to as paranormal experiences. So numinous experiences incorporated three other key categories or key factors, which includes the numinous, which is the connection with some kind of being, some kind of God as part of the experience. They could be a revelatory experience where the person feels that there was knowledge or information that they got from this spiritual presence. And there can be synchronicity experiences where people feel as if a coincidence of things means that there's something or someone or somebody that is kind of controlling what's going on in the world around us, but ultimately leads to this idea that there is some supernatural presence, some supernatural being. Mystical experiences, we've touched on this to some degree when we talk about the unity experience, the loss of the sense of self, but also the aesthetic experiences, the sense of beauty, wonderment that can occur either through wonderful art. When we were in Amsterdam, we saw the Van Gogh and the Vermeer exhibits, which obviously are deeply moving for many individuals. Or it could be out in nature, and when we were driving through the countryside, seeing a beautiful rainbow in the midst of the rain and the sun yesterday, which was just this incredible experience to be able to see. All of these kind of help us to feel connected to the world, connected to ourselves, connected to the universe in some kind of way. And then there is this other interesting category of paranormal experiences. Typically, these refer to experiences of a spirit, a ghost, a demon sometimes. And sometimes it is known to the person. It could be of a deceased loved one. In fact, those are very commonly described experiences when these what are often referred to in psychiatry as bereavement hallucinations, where a person feels that their loved one came to them at night or they were able to have a conversation with them, and ultimately can be very comforting for people who have lost a loved one. And then also the unknown. It's just some ghost or spirit that the person doesn't know anything about. So again, this just gives us another way of looking at these experiences to help us to understand what they are about and how they affect people. Now, in the context of psychiatry, but as well as spirituality, what we've been looking at so far are how these experiences affect us in the moment, when the person is in prayer, when the person is in meditation, when they're having the experience. But there's a growing body of research which is now looking at the longitudinal effects. What happens to you over time if you do these practices? What happens to you over time when you have these experiences? And this has a lot of very important implications, both for how these experiences change us spiritually, but also clinical implications in terms of how they may help people deal with depression, anxiety, or other types of mental health issues. So here is another SPECT scan that we did from a study of a practice called Kirtan Kriya meditation, where we took people who had never really meditated before, and we scanned their brain initially. That's the A scan here. That's their initial resting scan. Then we taught them how to do this very simple practice, and we scanned them again while they were doing the practice for the very first time. That was the B scan. We sent them home, and we had them do this practice. It was 12 minutes a day. We had them go home and do the practice 12 minutes a day for about 2 months, and then we brought them back and we scanned them again at rest, which is the C scan, and then we had them do the meditation one last time, which is the D scan. So the most important part of this slide are the A and the C scans, because those are the resting scans. This is not while the person's meditating. This is just how they are as a person. And there were two main findings that we saw. One of them is where the arrow is pointing, which is the thalamus. So in this individual, you can see that they started out with the thalamus being a little asymmetric, but when they came back after 2 months, the thalamus is much more symmetric, and I'm not sure I could convince you, but if you look a little harder, it may be that the other side is even a little bit more active, and in fact, when they are doing the meditation for the final time, you can see that the other side does actually become even that much more activated. So this is changing the thalamus over time. And if the thalamus is part, it's part of why I mentioned the thalamus earlier when I talk about that sense of clarity. If the thalamus is changing over time, maybe it is literally changing the way they look at reality. It's changing the way they think about the world around them. And the other finding that we noticed was also in the frontal lobes. So if you look here, the frontal lobe on the C scan has a lot more red in these different areas, and this includes part of what's called the anterior cingulate cortex, compared to what you see in the A scan. So their frontal lobe became more active over time. And the analogy that I often use to lay audiences is the idea of thinking about the brain like a muscle. And when you lift weights with the muscle becomes bigger and it becomes stronger. Well, the studies show, some studies that were not part of our research, but studies have shown that long-term meditators actually have thicker frontal lobes than people who are non-meditators. And that makes sense because, as I mentioned, the frontal lobes turn on when we concentrate on something. And so maybe it's not a surprise that if you're concentrating, you're actually increasing the thickness, the size of the frontal lobe. And that's part of what we're seeing here functionally, that the blood flow in the frontal lobe is more active. And this was correlated with improvements in memory, in concentration, and reductions in anxiety and stress and depression. If the frontal lobes, as we all know, coordinate activity with the limbic system, then they help to settle the limbic system down, they help to improve your self-control of your emotional processes, and that may all help us to understand what's going on when people do these kinds of meditative practices, including things like mindfulness and various mantra-based practices that change our feelings of anxiety and stress and depression, as well as change the way a person may feel about the world spiritually. This is going to be the last scan I show, which comes from a study that we did of people going through a very intense, immersive spiritual retreat program. For the Jesuits out there, we had people going through the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And so for about 1 week, they went to a retreat center and did this very deep, very profound spiritual practice. And this scan is a kind of scan called a DAT scan, which is looking at the dopamine transporter and actually also looks a little bit at the serotonin transporter in the brain. And we scan them before and after this spiritual retreat. Well, what did we see? I was actually a little surprised by this, and I've had to kind of rework some of my ideas about what may be going on when it comes to dopamine and serotonin. But clearly, when we're talking about large areas of the brain, the frontal lobe and the limbic system, there's a lot going on at the neurotransmitter level as well. Well, what you notice is that after the retreat, the person had less binding, there's decreased activity here, in the dopamine transporters, and actually turned out to be true of the serotonin transporter as well. And again, this was quantified, so you don't have to just take my word for it based on a scan. But what does this mean? I had thought that there would be a release of dopamine, and that because of that, there would actually be an upregulation of the dopamine transporter, but it looks like a little bit of the opposite occurs, that the transporter goes down. Well, for those of you, obviously, who know how these transporters work, they take up the excess dopamine, they take up the excess serotonin in the brain. So if there's less transporter available, that means that every time a person releases dopamine, it's going to probably result in a more intense experience. And this is kind of what happens with drugs like cocaine that blocks the dopamine transporter, that you get this flood of dopamine in the brain. And of course, the serotonin transporter, the site of many of our SSRIs, also has an effect on how our brain perceives the world, our sensory perceptions, which is what you see with psychedelics that affect the serotonin system, and ultimately the drugs that have antidepressant effects. So if you can create these kinds of changes by going through a week-long retreat, we might expect there to be changes in the way the person thinks about the world, feels about the world, and even experiences the world every time they do now walk into a church or a synagogue or something like that, where they have this new feeling because their brain has been sensitized to it. So I've mentioned neurotheology at the very beginning, and I want to just kind of come to a conclusion about that neurotheology to me then is really what all of this is we've been talking about. It is a unique field of scholarship that seeks to understand the relationship between the brain and theology very specifically, but more broadly between the mind and religion, how we as human beings and all of the mental and neurological processes, to define those very broadly, our psyche, our mind, our brain, how they have an influence and a connection to the theological, the religious, the spiritual, all the experiences and practices that we do. And of course, to me, neurotheology can be a very broad field, ranging from the very practical, the kinds of questions that you all may have about how to manage your patients who have religious or spiritual beliefs and how can we use that information practically and clinically, to very profound philosophical and theological questions about the nature of consciousness, the nature of free will, what is spirituality, and what is religion all about. So this to me is to me a very exciting area of research and a very new area for all of us to ultimately move into when we think about the relationship between the spiritual part of our lives and the psychological and biological part of our lives. So ultimately, neurotheology shows us that religious and spiritual experiences do have a tremendous impact on ourselves, on who we are as people. They help us to understand the transformational elements of these experiences on many aspects of our lives. And I think perhaps one of the most important take-home messages of that survey and all the studies that we've done is that it looks like ultimately anyone can have these experiences, and theoretically everyone can have these experiences. So there's some hope for us to think about how we can use these experiences to better ourselves as human beings and to help us understand not only who we are as individuals, but how we are as a species, and hopefully to take us from all of the struggles that we face today into a more compassionate, more empathic, and greater understanding of all of us, and perhaps into a new enlightenment. So I will leave it there. For those of you who are interested in exploring in more detail some of this information, I certainly would recommend The Varieties of Spiritual Experience. And there are other books also to delve more deeply into the discussion about neurotheology and how religion and spirituality affects us. And if you'd like to follow any of the work that we do, including the research articles, you're welcome to go to my research website, which is just andrewnewberg.com. And my daughter is getting me on Instagram, so you can try that as well. Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, thanks.